Thank you for coming and welcome to this event at the PCCB. Cities Reimagined, bringing everyone on board the necessary path to greener and more resilient urban cities. Of course, I would like to thank PCCB, Paris Committee on Capacity Building, for providing us this space to interact with you and the experts. Well, we all know that there is no universal definition of just transition, but when we speak of the just transition, we can identify the elements that are associated with just transitions. For example, social protection, social dialogue, retraining, reskilling, retooling. All these elements put people at the center of the discussion of the just transition. In my line of work, we see just transition from the perspective of workforce, hence the scope being just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. But as the discussion of the topic advances, the scope has reasonably extended to social and economic aspect. That is the social and economic aspect of the transition of the workforce itself. Under the UNFCCC Katowice Committee on Impact, or we usually call KCI, was established to provide technical support and advice in the discussion or negotiation under the response measure workstream, under which just transition is covered. The committee has published several papers. One of the papers speak to, in a broad manner, to just transition topic, providing kind of brief information, what are the impacts of the transitions, what are the impacts of policies, socio and economic impacts, of course. Another paper recently was published, which showcases some just transition strategies taken by communities, by countries in different sectors in various countries. Last June, during the sessions, climate conference session in Bonn, KCI organized a side event, a dialogue with experts on this topic, particularly in the energy sector. Now today, we would like to promote the dialogue even more of just transition in a different sector, as you know, in urban sectors today. For this, I'm pleased that we have panelists that can provide valuable insights to us and to the discussion. The first panelist is Councillor Susan Aitken. Susan was elected leader of Glasgow City Council in 2017, forming Glasgow's ever SNP-led city government. First elected as councillor in 2012, following a career in public policy and communication. She was reappointed as council leader in 2022. Under her leadership, Glasgow hosted the UN Climate Summit in 2021. She was Scottish Local Politician of the Year in 2019 for ending historic gender pay discrimination, and Scottish Council Leader of the Year in 2021 for leadership on climate issues. Susan was one of the 40 global city leaders selected for the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative class of 2023. Susan, I'll ask you to kind of take your seat. Our next speaker is Laila Castaldo. She's the Global Coordinator on Climate Justice of Building Worker International. Under this role, Laila has overall responsibility for the global coordination of BWI's work, engagement and campaign on climate change and just transition issues, as well as engaging with counterparts globally. Her primary task is to plan and implement the lobbying campaign and project management around the thematic priorities for climate justice. With that, I would invite Laila to be on the podium. And last, of course, not least, is Anjali Mahendra, Global Director Research of WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. Anjali leads WRI Cities Research Agenda, supports team in conducting actionable and innovative research across all program areas of the WRI Ross Center. She led the WRI flagship World Resource Report towards a more equal city. We might be hearing this from her later, which identifies priority actions for rapidly growing cities in the global south to ensure equitable access to core urban services for all the residences. Anjali, please take your seat. I'll go over here. Oh, sorry then. Thank you so much for coming with us. I'd like to go to Councillor Susan first. Glasgow has really marked itself in the global map when it hosted COP21 in 2021, to COP26 in 2021. If my memory is correct, I think it was the outcome of the Glasgow conference. That was the first time we saw the mentioning of just transition in the cover decision after some years. In 2022, the Glasgow City Council approved Just Transition Skills Action Plan. Now, can you tell me how that came about? What were the drivers for the city to actually pursue the transition or climate actions, but more importantly, the just transition itself? Because we're not only talking about transition, it's the just part that we need to emphasize.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So Glasgow, for those who don't know, the city is a post-industrial city. We were a centre of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but then underwent rapid deindustrialisation, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. And that was very much an unjust transition. Entire communities were left behind. And to this day, the city still suffers from the legacies of that. There is generational worklessness. The grandchildren and even great-grandchildren of people who lost their jobs in deindustrialisation continue to be economically inactive, live in households where no one has ever worked. There are severe public health impacts as a consequence of it. Glasgow has very significant health inequalities which are significantly related to poverty and to community deprivation as well as household deprivation. And there are physical impacts on the city as well. We have the highest amount of vacant and derelict post-industrial land of any city in the UK, and a lot of that land is toxic. It is contaminated with industrial chemicals, so it's extremely expensive to remediate and bring back into use and value for the community. So we see the transition to net zero, and our target is net zero by 2030, not just as an opportunity to reduce our emissions, and not just as an opportunity to create new jobs and transition to a much fairer new green economy, but also to redress the injustices of the past, to use the billions of pounds that we're going to be investing in that net zero transition, in infrastructure and various other interventions to actually address those legacies, deeply embedded legacies of the unjust transition of 50 or so years ago. And that's why we focused very much on just transition as being the heart of all of our climate plans. And the work that we've done, particularly recently, we had an election last year in 2022, and following that we established a cross-party just transition working group in my council. And it came out with a number of 18 recommendations, which are quite high-level recommendations, and a lot of those are around jobs and work, but they're also about mobility, about access to energy and energy security, affordable energy. They're about ensuring that the interventions that we undertake to make buildings more energy efficient are done in an equitable manner. And so we're working just now to develop implementation action plans across all of those recommendations. But crucially, we've started with skills and work. And interestingly, when in the run-up to COP26, we did a citizens' assembly of people from across Glasgow, from all different backgrounds, and different income levels. And the thing that came through most strongly in their recommendations, and the thing that they were most excited about in terms of climate action and its potential impact for themselves and their own lives and their own communities, was about jobs. New, green, high quality, highly skilled, sustainable jobs, and sustainable in both senses of the word. Sustainable in terms of the impact on our planet, but also sustainable in that these are not, they're secure jobs that will last for the long term. So we developed our Just Transition Skills Action Plan, which has 25 recommendations around three key themes of making sure, essentially focusing on making sure that we are driving equity. And quite a significant workforce analysis and jobs analysis within that. Scotland, where the city, the country that Glasgow is the largest city of, also has a strong commitment to just transition. Indeed, we have a cabinet secretary in government for net zero and just transition. But they're very focused, the Scottish Government is very focused on the oil and gas sector in the northeast of Scotland, around the city of Aberdeen, and that's understandable. But for me, that's perhaps too narrow a focus for what the just transition is. And the analysis that we've done identified a number of other sectors where there are real risks and threats to jobs that people are in just now, and a necessity to make sure that those workers are upskilled or retrained and that they're not left behind, but also that there are enormous opportunities in some of these sectors and that they will be in huge demand. So construction is an obvious one. Anything to do with motor trades, transportation, freight, for example, again, real issues there where some of these jobs are going to become obsolete, so we need to make sure that the workers are ready for new opportunities, but also that those new opportunities are there, because there are going to be huge demand for those new skills, and we need to match the people to the demand and make sure that that's properly aligned. And there's also, I think, another area that's overlooked, which is some low-income jobs in sectors like retail and hospitality, for example, where there's already a lot of job insecurity often, where I think there's an enormous risk around employers who will use the costs of transition and within their own businesses to decarbonisation as an excuse to actually make their workforce even more insecure and low paid. So there's some real issues there which I'm not sure we've quite got to grips with yet as to how we actually address that. But I think it's very important that that isn't overlooked. But for us, it is all about making sure that every aspect of our transition is just, that it drives equity, not just that it doesn't exacerbate inequity, but we actually use it as an opportunity to reduce the inequalities gap in all sorts of areas in our city, but in particular that we use it as an opportunity for economic transformation as well as environmental transformation.
Thank you, Susan. I'll come back to you with on follow-up on the engaging stakeholder citizens. Now I'd like to come to Laila. Coming from Building Workers International, you have the perspective from the trade union. Now, in what way has the transition or climate actions impacted workers, especially in the area, in the sector that you are with?
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, I want to say that what you just said really resonates a lot with our demands and our concerns and our, big issues that construction workers are facing. So at BWI, we represent workers in building and construction, forestry and wood, 12 million workers worldwide. And as such, workers in this sector are very much affected by climate change. Why? Because many of those workers, building and construction, they work outdoor, so they are exposed to increased temperature, to extreme weather events, and these has a lot of concerns and issues for their health. Just think about, for example, heat stress, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, but all the kind of problems that are linked to being exposed to heat and increased temperature. So, as many people are, more and more people are relocating to cities, especially because of the effect of migration, but also displacement of people from urban areas. We can see that in cities there is a need that is generated and more demands for retrofitting, renovating buildings, for more construction. But however, if we don't tackle the issues linked with workers in construction, then these can only exacerbate certain issues that already exist. And I'm not talking only about heat. For example, let's think about the air quality of the air, pollution. All of these, if they're not tackled, they can become really a big issue and risk for the health and safety of workers. We also represent, and we are concentrating a lot of our efforts to address the issue of migrant workers. So migrant workers also make up a lot of workers in building and construction, and they are also disproportionately affected by climate change and extreme weather events. Many of them, they're displaced from their country of origin, and they try to look for a better life and a better work going into cities. But we also have to consider that those workers are mostly and many times deprived of basic rights, like, for example, social protection, legal protection, trade union representations, and then they're mainly like occupied in professions like construction, which are informal, low income, and are exposed to exploitations. But just to give me more of insight of like what's the working condition of workers there are working in building construction, we sometimes like to use this expression of the 3D, so the work in construction is dirty, difficult, and dangerous, the 3D. And a lot of times we can see that there's a lot of several layers of subcontracting, workers are informal, are unskilled, untemporary, and they are unsafe. So at BWI, especially for this COP, we are concentrating our efforts really to advocate for better health and safety protection for migrant workers who are exposed to health issues linked to heat stress and the effect of heat and working in high increased temperature. So I just wanted to show the manifesto that we've issued for this COP, where we are pledging government and international stakeholders for better health and safety protections, for better regulations, and also for company employers to enforce this in the workplace. So if you are interested, reach out to me after this presentation. I can share it with you. Yeah, so I don't know if you're gonna on the second time, like how can we involve workers?
We can continue the conversation. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Laila. Now, Anjali, the conversation around just transition has been most dominated by energy sector. We have also, by the way, we also have seen cities making pledges to climate actions, but it seems like the element of just itself might have been missing. So how far the discussion on just transition emerged in city or urban sector, and how have cities understood the concept of just transition and incorporated just transition in their climate actions?
Can you hear me? Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I work in World Resources Institute. We call ourselves a think and do tank. So we do a lot of research on what needs to happen in terms of just transitions and inclusive climate action in cities. But we also work in several countries, particularly in the global south, major countries, with city government, with national governments to embed these ideas into their plans and activities. So to your point about how far this has happened in cities, it is very much an emerging agenda. And it's, you know, I think COVID and the pandemic definitely triggered this awakening around equity issues and making sure they're much more dominant in urban planning and when we're trying to make sectoral investments. I know you've been referring to urban as a sector, but you know, we think of cities as systems where you have so many sectors coming together, right? There's investments in transportation, in housing and buildings, and waste management, and so on. All of them have a connection to climate. So many of the key sectors that are important for climate mitigation and adaptation both are all of these sectors that I'm talking about, buildings, transport, waste management, energy. And most of these, you know, you mentioned the key word, they have so much proportion of informal labor, particularly in the global south cities. It's not only the construction sector, think about transportation. Anybody here who's familiar with, you know, African cities, South Asian cities, you know the matatus in Kenya, you know the auto rickshaws in India. It's migrants coming into the cities, running essentially the transportation services because public transport is quite deficient, quite lacking. And that's an immense value add in these cities. They are filling the gap where public services don't exist. And it's transportation, it's waste collection. A lot of waste pickers in cities are part of the informal economy. They're actively involved in the recycling task and waste segregation task. So what we want to do in terms of climate action in cities absolutely needs to consider the living conditions of these workers. And by the way, we've been doing some research. 50 to 80 to 90%, depending on whether you're looking across South Asia, Latin America, or Africa, of the urban employment is informal. And these are parts of the world where cities are growing the most rapidly, so the investment coming into some of these sectors is coming in very rapidly. Cities are growing. Capacity is weak in terms of policy and enforcement, and therefore labor conditions in these sectors, you know, remain the way they are, and this situation is continuing to worsen and get exacerbated with all the climate risks like heat and flooding and all of that coming in. I talked about sectors where people work informally. Informality is a very big part of this conversation in another way. There's informal settlements, right? There are slums. Think about cities like Kampala, think about cities like Mumbai, where they say 50% of the 20 to 22 million population lives in slums. And there's a high proportion of home-based work that happens in these settlements. Dharavi, which is, you know, one of the biggest slums in Asia and is in Mumbai, has a turnover of 1 billion, they say. This is not data that exists in the public realm. People go out and figure out and try to quantify, and that's what we need to do so much more of, you know, try to really highlight the value add to the urban economy of these workers, and then make sure that the investments coming into the construction, the buildings, the transport, the waste sector, because of climate, or because of just other urban investment that is coming in because these cities are growing, needs to take these issues into account. The worker rights, the job security, formalizing their work conditions, but with benefits for them. Simple examples are, you know, we work with electrification of the vehicle fleet. Think of the 2- and 3-wheelers, the informal transport that I talked about. Why can't we use electrification of vehicles as an opportunity to not just improve the condition, not just improve the technology, but to improve the livelihoods of these workers, make sure they're take more money to take back home at the end of the day, make sure they have more rights. Look at it from the user perspective, look at it from the operator perspective. So those are just some ideas. I'll just say one thing for those who are interested here. We've done a lot of work with the organization called CapaCITIES. You probably know it's a network of cities in what we call inclusive climate action. And we've developed resources on systematically looking at all these climate actions that cities try to implement, whether on the mitigation side or the adaptation side, and systematically, how can you make them more inclusive and try to get rid of, try to break away some of those entrenched inequities, try to introduce these justice elements into the design of policies and plans related to climate. And so that's an inclusive climate action toolkit that exists out there. We've done the work that you mentioned at the beginning on citiesforall.org. So yeah, happy to talk more in another round.
Thank you, Anjali. Before we go to the audience, I'd like to go, I feel like I need to ask one more questions to you, starting with Councillor Susan. You mentioned about the citizen assembly in the run-up to the COP26. Can you share more on your experience in engaging with the stakeholders, particularly in the how that process can fit into the designing process of the just transition or the plan itself, in particularly how that can help address any adverse impact, and of course also as important is to maximize the co-benefits that might arise from the transition.
Yes, so I mentioned earlier that Glasgow has a lot of poor health outcomes, particularly for the poorest people in the city. And our health outcomes are actually much worse than comparable post-industrial cities, like Liverpool in England, for example, which has a lot of similarities. But Glasgow's healthy life expectancy is much poorer, and no one's entirely sure why that is. But there is some research that suggests it might be something to do with people feeling a lack of control and a lack of agency in their lives, and feeling that things are done to them all the time, and that they and the communities that they live in are imposed upon rather than leading in what happens to them. So again, that's another reason to make sure that we reverse what has been done in the past, often with the best of intentions perhaps, but not with good outcomes, and that we don't do to people, but rather listen to them and respond to what they tell us about what they need from this transition and the outcomes that they want for themselves, their households and their communities. So we think it's a very important part of Just Transition to ensure that it is community and citizen-led as much as possible. It's challenging. There are a lot of what we're going to have to do around both emissions reduction and also adaptation is quite disruptive. So when we think about heat transition, for example, most people in Scotland heat their homes with a combination electricity and gas from the North Sea. Most of Scotland's electricity, almost all of it now, is renewably generated, but we still use a lot of gas, and at some point we're going to have to get those gas boilers out of people's homes, literally out of their homes, and we're also going to have to go into their homes to improve insulation and to retrofit older buildings to make them more energy efficient, for example. So this needs to be about trust, and it needs to be starting from a point where citizens are shaping the policies and shaping what happens to them, because inevitably there is going to be some doing too as part of this process. So it needs to feel like something that's shared, or we will replicate some of the mistakes and the bad outcomes of the past. So that's something that's a very big focus for us, and we see very much as part of that Just Transition. So we're working very closely with civil society. So for the Just Transition Action Plan, for example, a Skills Action Plan, we work closely with the trade unions, where we're a big stakeholder in that. It's about workers. We needed to have workers' representatives helping to shape those recommendations, and that was invaluable in doing so. And I'm certain that it's a much better plan as a consequence of that involvement. We're working closely with the non-profit sector in the city, which in Scotland is often described as the community sector. Is often based in places, in local places and neighbourhoods, and is led by people that come from those neighbourhoods. So we're working closely with them, also to use data. We're the only UK city that's part of the Open Government Partnership, and we're very committed to making data not just available but actually accessible so that communities can use it to shape outcomes for themselves. And we're generating more and more data around climate and around the impact of climate interventions or the potential impact of them. So we're working with our non-profit sector to try to use that richness of data that we've got to provide genuine insight and also genuine route maps for communities to set their own local climate action plans. Some of what we're going to do inevitably is going to be on a large scale. Housing retrofit is an example. We have identified 450,000 homes in Glasgow's metropolitan region that require some level of retrofit. And one of the other things that we need to make sure is that there's no upfront cost to citizens for that. It's a big part of just transition is who pays. And it can't be ordinary citizens, it can't be ordinary residents who pay. But equally, it can't really be us as a city, as a council that pays, because we have constraints in our finances. And when all this is done, we still have to deliver public services. So people need still at the end of this process to have education services, to have care services, to have waste and refuse services. So we need to find the right financial models for this as well, so that we're not imposing on people, not least because that if we're expecting residents to pay up front for home insulation, for example, that will simply drive further inequity because those who can afford to do so or to fit heat pumps will take advantage of that. But the corollary of that is that we're going to be undertaking some massive public works projects where we will be going out at scale to do massive interventions to places, and so that needs to have a neighbourhood focus. And we're working very closely involves a model called Net Zero Neighbourhoods, where we will work with local people to help them shape their plans and how we go about decarbonising their homes. So it needs to be done at scale to make it economically viable, but we also want to have it done at a level so that people feel it connects with them and their place, and that we're able to talk through with them the benefits, the time scale for them getting those benefits, which in Glasgow will be primarily around much more affordable energy and a reduction in fuel poverty, which is one of our biggest social justice challenges in the city. So there's no one single way to approach this. We need to involve communities and citizens on a whole number of different levels because the transition is going to affect their lives in lots of different ways.
I think they want you to use this mic.
Oh, okay, I was finished anyway.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Susan. I'll have the microphone. Laila, you mentioned about the informal workers, Anjali too. I think I wanted to give I wanted to show the stats, but I'm sure the audience have been convinced by you saying that. Now, I would like to hear the experience from you, especially how workers have been involved in the process. Again, noting that the number of informal workers in this sector is very high. I think even I recall in some countries, even when it comes to women in this particular sector, even 100 of them are all informal workers.
Of course. Which one do you have to use?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the issue of informal workers is really a serious issue for the sector because, of course, because they don't have like a regular employment contract, so it's also more difficult to reach to them as a union and you know, to have union representation because, of course, they are afraid of losing their job. They are afraid of you know, that they're going to lose out of the little that they have, even if it's an informal work. And as I said, most of the time they are marginalized, low-income migrant workers, so it's really very difficult, and that's why, you know, it's a very pressing issues for us to reach out to those workers. But coming back on the issues how we can involve workers, of course, I think we can all agree that you cannot have a just transition. So the just means that you have to involve those that are most impacted. So when we look at, you know, what cities need for making a just transition, so this requires a massive investment in technology, in green infrastructure, in retrofitting, but we also have to consider that most of the time, those who have access to those are just the privileged and the more wealthiest. So if we really want to have a just transition, we have to make sure that everyone can access to the, you know, the greener, more affordable and sustainable housing and climate resilient infrastructure. Otherwise, we will create just more climate injustice, what we call climate injustice. There are, of course, good examples of unions' involvement, and also many of our members have mobilized to around the issue of climate justice. We have produced last year a report on 100 union action on climate justice that we've published for the last COP. But of course, this is not enough, and still there are not enough involvement of workers in the decisions that are affecting them in transition. So. That's why unions, they really need to use their leverage to press employers and government to ensure that the workers' voices are heard and represented. So one issue that you also touched, and I think it's very important because it really impacts on workers, is the issue of skills and training. Because you know, you need to upskill, reskill, and provide training programs that so that the workers can take up on the green transitions. Because if you don't have those workers ready to take on this job, you will lose out on the transition. So, and this will just stay an aspiration. So we can talk about, you know, creating green jobs, creating new jobs out of the green transition. But then, what we hear a lot from our members is that there's a lot of skills shortages. So workers are not prepared, workers are not ready. So that's why there is a big investment needs to be done by involving government, city councils, companies and unions at the same table to really look at what the future job will look like, what skills will be needed, and so to adapt also the qualification framework and skill set so that they can, you know, we can have the right skills that are needed. I just want also to touch upon also the role of the cities and how unions and cities can work together and how this can benefit workers. You have mentioned, for example, C40. So BWI has signed a memorandum of understanding with C40. We work together in several cities, so bringing together the cities and the unions at the same table. But there are on several levels where cities and unions can work together. For example, one thing that I wanted to mention is the issue of public procurement. So public procurement is an instrument and tools that can be used for cities and unions to set some rules so that, you know, companies that are awarded a contract, they are awarded on the basis of social and environmental considerations. So you can have public procurement be used to include, for example, issues related to green transition, but as well to creating good jobs, so that jobs that are created are covered by collective agreement, that are protected, and they have access to social protection and training and retraining. So all in all, what we're asking is a worker-centered just transition where workers are represented and where workers have a voice and they can have a say on their future. Thank you.
Thank you, Laila. Anjali, what are the challenges that we have seen so far when it comes to just transitioning the city into a more green living place?
Yeah, so in some of the work that we've been doing, we find that, of course, you know, this collaboration that you're talking about, as much as it's needed, it's often not happening. In fact, some of these informal workers are stigmatized in cities. I mean, we have heard cases of certainly informal transport operators not being allowed to run their services on the major routes in a city because it's going to compete with public transport, or street vendors, or waste pickers being sort of stigmatized, right? Not really. I mean, they're really being treated as second-class citizens. They're informal workers. They live in and work in the worst of conditions. So cities have not across the board, obviously, been recognizing the challenges they face or supporting them. So a big challenge there is recognizing the value that these informal workers add to the urban economy, to the service provision that goes on in all of these sectors. And that speaks to the data piece. This is all difficult data to gather in the Global South, but it's a necessary job. It needs to be done so that city leaders and national leaders can be sensitized to these issues. And where that's happening, you do see some great examples coming up. So we've done a case study, for example, in the city of Pune in India, where it's a great case of, informal waste pickers being integrated, their jobs being formalized because the city municipal corporation really recognizes how much value they add in terms of the door-to-door waste segregation that they do. They formalize those jobs, they've secured the livelihoods, and in fact, not only that, working with some civil society groups, they've been able to advocate to the national government that there needs to be a law around supporting street vendors and waste pickers, and so there's a national law that came out of it. This is a long trajectory of change, maybe over a decade, but there are examples like this. Then on the other side, there is also another example, great one from India that is uppermost in my mind because, we run, the World Resources Institute runs something that we call the Prize for Cities. We've been running it for 3 cycles, and we really try to look for examples that exemplify inclusive, green, resilient cities. And anybody can submit an entry. And so from the state of Odisha in India, there's a great example of something they call the Jaga mission, where, when you had COVID and you had all these migrant workers needing to leave the city overnight. I'm sure many of you have seen the horrific pictures from India where you had migrant workers having to walk hundreds of kilometers. They couldn't use public transport and leave the city, essentially. But in this particular state, what they did is, it's about how do you try to address multiple goals together, the workers' rights, but also improving your city, right? Making it more green and resilient. So in this case, what they did is they put together what's called an urban wage employment scheme, first of its kind in India, to say, hey, migrant workers, we will keep them in the city. The places where they live and work, these informal settlements, we will get them to support building those basic services and infrastructure related to drainage and water and sanitation, housing, self-built housing in these communities, guarantee them a wage and improve these settlements in the process. And it ended up becoming so successful that post-COVID, it has been institutionalized, it's being replicated at the national level in multiple states. These are all ideas, that are they so powerfully demonstrate, I think, the just transition agenda. And we just need to, I think, share more of these stories. And the other thing I'll say, because you talked about the partnership between cities and unions, we really need these, what we call multi-level partnerships, right? Certainly between communities of workers, informal workers or formal, working with the city, but cities also working with national governments. At the local climate action summit that just happened at this COP for the very first time, it's a pretty big deal, on December 1st and 2nd, there was something called CHAMP. It's a mouthful. It's Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. It's a pledge that about 65, 70 countries sign on to, basically to say that the national leaders of these countries, national policymakers, will support local leaders, that's city leaders, in implementing all kinds of climate policies, enabling them, supporting them. And in fact, that is a very important step because it speaks to another big challenge. You asked about challenges. What's not happening enough of is that the finance is not flowing to cities. It's not flowing to some of these issues that we're interested in. It's flowing to technical solutions like electrification of vehicles, distributed renewable energy, low carbon buildings. It's not flowing to, these sort of more holistically designed measures that involve partnerships of cities and communities and workers working together. So we need much more of that happening. The finance needs to flow to the most vulnerable workers and communities within cities, and there are not enough mechanisms yet for that to happen. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anjali. With that, I would like to open the floor to our audience if anyone would like to ask anything to our panels. Yes, of course. Sorry, do we have a microphone, or I'll just...
Thank you. I am Marcos Voutman from Brazil, and I would like to share a reflection and ask the panelists to elaborate if possible. Something that has happened recently in Brazil and in so many countries, which is a shadow phenomena of such importance as is climate change, is the rise of extremism and the far right. And in my experience as a political scientist and a city manager, we discovered that public engagement and mostly the feeling of belonging, bringing back the people from resentment and exclusion, helped very much prevent the rise of extreme right violence in Brazil. This was a local, although very successful experience. And this is, to me, something that is highly important because often this is a discussion that is overshadowed by the urgency that we have of implementing measures of adaptation and mitigation. But in Brazil, we had 4 years of not only not implementing the necessary solutions, as of destruction of everything that was implemented for 10 or 15 years, though limited as it was. Now we were able to recover, we were able to bring back our democracy and start again. We are here. But this is something that I would like to share, because far-right extremism is mostly moved by resentment of not being included, and city participation and community rescuing this necessary bond that exists beyond people is as a effective measure of preventing the rise of extremism and strengthening democracies, as urgent as is the creation of new solutions. So this is a reflection that I'd like to share and ask everyone to please elaborate a bit with your experiences too.
Okay, thank you. Probably we'll take 2 more intervention from the audience before we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bello Sakina from Nigeria and a member of the UNFCCC Youth Wing. It's interesting that a lot of conversation were coming around the informal sector, and I could align with her when she began to talk about the transport sector, the waste management sector, and how Africa is actually having a lot of issues around that. And I want to inform the House that not just the informal sector, there is a huge gap there. But coming back to the formal sector, even in the educational level, for Nigeria as a country, we're now trying to see how the school curriculum can actually align into the green skills. Before now, if you go to school, it's just the basic curriculum that you have been taught, and if you're out of school, you have to go in for some level of capacity building before you can meet up some construction and engineering thing. So it's a lot of issues that even when people go to school, we're talking about robotics and artificial intelligence, taking charge of the workforce, and the school curriculum is not actually looking at our students, especially for young people who are going to move into the sector in the next 5 years, on how to see how they can strengthen their capacity to actually champion those workspace. In the next 10 years, it's going to be a whole lot of youth revolution, but then how do we ensure that the young people are actually having the skill necessary to transform the century? Thank you.
Do we have another request from the floor? Yeah, at the back.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Haley Kiesling. I am an undergrad student at Indiana University in the States. And so I'm just kind of curious, some of you touched on it a little bit with the informal settlements, but how is the unhoused population being served in this just transition? Maybe especially in Glasgow, where you have high concentrations of those with joblessness, or even in South Asia, kind of how you were talking about, and even those urban workers, and how are they finding homes, especially we're talking about the retrofitting and things like that. So if you could just speak to that a little bit, the unhoused population. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Can we start with you, Councillor?
Okay, so I'll maybe take those in reverse order. On that last one, we have a high population, a growing population in Glasgow just now of people who are presenting themselves as homeless as a direct consequence of the cost of living crisis in the UK just now. However, they're not unhoused. They are all in accommodation. We have very, very low levels of rough sleeping and street homelessness, very, very low. So we get people under a roof, essentially, particularly at this time of year where the weather in Glasgow is the opposite of what it is here in Dubai, and people are at real risk from the cold. But I think a big part of the just transition, and a big part of our social policy anyway, is building affordable homes. So we are building at least 5,000 affordable homes a year in Glasgow just now. By affordable, we mean primarily homes for social rent. 80% of those homes are for social rent. And it all speaks to, and actually it connects into the first point about those who would predate on the poorest and the most vulnerable, opportunistic and divisive politicians from the right, who, of course, deny climate change exists, but are seeking to exploit those who are most likely to be the victims of climate change. The more that we can build cohesive and resilient communities, the more defence we will have against that kind of exploitation, those that are seeking to undermine democracy. And so housing, access to decent homes has to be absolutely part of that. For us in Glasgow as well, though, we also have very large numbers of existing homes, and indeed most of our new build homes are highly energy efficient. They're extremely high quality, particularly those in the social rented sector. It's the older homes are the ones that are vulnerable in terms of both having high emissions, but also energy insecurity and fuel poverty, which people suffer from. And I think even in a country like the UK, where we don't have the far right in government, but we do have the right, and Angeli talked about the CHAMP initiative, for example. The UK government hasn't signed up to that, and the UK government right now, and the UK government is likely to change next year, but I'm not seeing a big change in terms of policy direction. They're walking back from climate commitments. There is a watering down of climate commitments, which is a real concern. And worse than that, though, what we're seeing is lip service paid to net zero ambitions, but then the individual actions required to achieve them being picked off and opposed one by one. So to give just one example, we in Glasgow have just implemented from this June, fully implemented a low emission zone in our city centre, and cars that are over a certain age are not allowed to enter the city centre anymore. That has had an impact, undoubtedly. It has inconvenienced quite a lot of people, including a significant number of our taxi drivers. People might be aware of Mayor Sadiq Khan in London, who has been very courageous in implementing his ultra-low emission zone. We are absolutely clear that this is a necessary public health measure. Poor air quality kills people. It kills people in Glasgow, it kills people in London, and it damages quality of life as well. But in our case in Glasgow, and even more so in London, We have faced legal challenge and we have faced political challenge. There are political risks for democratically elected leaders who want to drive forward with climate action, and it's even more important that we have support for the kinds of programmes that Anjali was talking about, that rather than just technical solutions, that the finance is going to support resilience and cohesion in communities, because the less of that there is and the more insecure communities feel, the more difficult it will be for politicians to drive forward the technical solutions. And so there needs to be a balance there, and that will give us more of a defence and a bulwark against the encroachment of the far right and their exploitation of the issues that and the pressures that a lot of communities are facing just now. And on the issue of skills in schools, I could not agree more. 100%. This journey has to start right now. It has to start with our children and our young people. And for girls particularly, the green jobs are presented as valid career options for them to start preparing for and start building for. A lot of what I talked about was existing jobs that are going to become obsolete, and a focus perhaps on older workers and those older workers being left behind. But equally, we want to make sure that the new workers who are leaving our schools and colleges and universities have clear pathways to accessing these high quality, highly skilled and I would hope well paid jobs that are associated with the green transition. And that means that there need to be non-graduate routes to these jobs as well, that there need to be routes through training and work. It's actually in-work learning, that it doesn't have to be the case that everyone goes to university and comes out with a degree in order to access these jobs, because that then will lead to poorer sections of our community being excluded, those who perhaps don't have a history of higher education in their families. But you're absolutely right. The process needs to start now with our kids and our young people. And interestingly, my last point, during COP26, we ran a programme in Glasgow where every roughly 14 and 15-year-old girl in our schools took part in a programme called Girls at COP, and every single school was involved in discussions throughout the period of the COP, and they talked about everything from sustainable fashion to nature. But one of the things that they were most interested in was how can I as a girl work in the new green economy? What is there for me in that new green economy? And that's 14 and 15-year-old girls wanting to know that information, asking that question. We need to have the answers for them right now.
Thank you, Councillor Susan. Laila, would you like to
Yeah, so I'll try not to repeat, because I really agree with what you just said. So I just try not to repeat what you just said, because I think I can sign up on everything you said. But just going in order, like talking to the colleagues that are coming from Brazil, well, we also represent workers in forestry, and we've been engaging a lot on protecting also tropical forests. And also there's a lot of informality also for workers working in tropical forest, and a lot of human rights abuses and workers' rights abuses. So we've been very happy to hear, President Lula said it will commit to deforestation and working with unions. So this is very, very promising. But about your comment about the right-wing government, the right-wing political parties, the thing is that they are really building on people's fears. And, as we are trying to organize migrant workers, that's one issue. For example, many workers think that migrants are just stealing their job. And, and those parties are using this argument and say, oh, they're migrant workers, they're stealing their job. That's why it's important to organize them into a union and have them have access to legal protection, so that we don't put workers one against each other. So, because that's the thing that they will play the game of the right-wing parties and movements. And responding to the issue of like, raising awareness about green job and green skills, as I say, I could sign up, we just said, but really maybe what I want to highlight is that I don't think a green worker knows he's a green worker. If, for example, someone who is driving a bus is driving an electric bus and is not driving anymore a bus which is driven with, using fuel, for example, do you think that worker knows he's a green worker? Probably not. So there's a lot of investment that needs to be done, not only in green skills, but also in the creating the awareness and the involvement that workers can play a role in this transition. And lastly, responding to the question about sustainable housing, maybe what I want to stress there is really the big contrast, and that's what I said in my previously about the climate injustice of seeing, we could see even in the COP28 premises, this nice building, top-notch technology, retrofitted with the green technologies, and then who is working to build that, like workers, most of the time migrant, who are working in very bad living conditions, and and you can see really the contrast between the big buildings that only the wealthy will access, and those who are building it, they are living in poverty. So that's really that gap that we need to fill. I hope I answered questions.
Okay. Thank you, Laila. Anjali, if you can briefly address those comments.
Sure. And without repeating again, on Brazil, totally agree with you on how some of this agenda that we're talking about, just transitions, this just gets pushed behind when you have more of those, those right-wing politics. But just to give you the experience, because we have a pretty active Brazil office, and we should talk later because we do a lot of work in cities in Brazil, and with the Ministry of Cities at the federal level. We kept up our work with particular cities. In fact, this Transformative Urban Coalitions work that's been displayed there, WRI is a partner on it, in Recife, and some of the cities where you have the leadership that supports it, we were able to carry on, not at the national level so much. However, this is the COP where everybody's saying Brazil is back. This is the time we take the opportunity. There's a lot of work going on with Brazil's national urbanization policy, national adaptation plan, where I would say use the opportunity, embed these ideas as much as you all can at the city level, at the national level, because this is the time while you have Lula's leadership. And happy to talk further about how we can collaborate on that sort of thing. On Nigeria and the skills piece, completely agree with you and what's been said. We really need to focus on skilling the youth. They say the statistic is 30%, a whole third of the urban population growth out to 2050 will be in Nigeria, India, and China. So Nigeria is going to have that explosion of youth populations needing jobs. We need to be thinking about the right skills that serve the needs now of the green and resilient economy. But one thing I'll add there is, the onus is not only on the public sector. It is there too, but all the private investment that's coming into countries like Nigeria, in all of these sectors, there needs to be a responsibility that the private sector needs to take. So to give you one example, British International Investment invests in African countries, South Asian countries in the construction and real estate sector. We worked with them to design an impact framework for their investments. And we made sure it includes inclusivity issues, made sure that it includes considerations around who you partner with in these countries, which developers. Are you ensuring secure livelihoods and skills and retraining for the migrant workers that are working on the buildings you're investing in, and the huge industrial parks and the hotels? And so that's another way, we need to work in partnership with the private sector to make sure they are sensitized to these issues, because so much of the investment coming into these sectors is through them. On the last one, you asked a very important question in my view, because I think housing, we think of housing, but housing is actually an integrator of all other sectors. By providing climate resilient, low carbon housing is not just a house, it's the energy, the electricity, the water, the sanitation that goes with it. So it is actually a great entry point to intervene in all of these sectors. And just to that end, and talking about, again, inclusive programs and working with communities, we've just set up, launched just last week, actually, before this COP, something we call REHOUSE as an acronym. It's Resilient, Equitable Housing, Opportunities, and Urban Services. It's a program where we're partnering with community-based organizations, some of the most influential and largest in the world, like Habitat for Humanity International, Slum Dwellers International, Mahila Housing Trust in India, BRAC from Bangladesh, Build Change. We're partnering with them to exactly on this agenda, resilient, equitable housing, integrated with the whole package of urban services for those living in urban informal settlements. So we've just begun on this journey. Happy to talk more and share more. You can go to rehouse.org and find out more. Thanks.
Thank you, Anjali. Just 2 points probably I would like to put out before we close is that when we talk about transition, I think we should leave the fact that, we should not ignore the fact that it's cross-sector. We can talk about energy sector, but we should know that it impacts other sectors. I think similarly, when one sector transition, it definitely going to impact another sectors. And another point which I would like to highlight is the opportunity when we talk about transition or a city going or transitions to a greener city, there are opportunities that come with it. For example, like co-benefits, health benefits to the citizen. And this is really something that needs to be highlighted when we want to transition. With that, thank you very much to our panelists. It's been a great honor to have you here, and a round of applause, please, to our panelists.